Hi, welcome to another episode of I Mustache You Something. I've got the famous, infamous, beloved, misunderstood Robby Aziz. Uh, I've known Robby for longer than he remembers, and he was one of the most can I say challenging? Is that a nice word? That's not a nice word. I'll say it
It's
anyway. One of the most challenging kids that I saw growing up in St. Mark's, Natick, in Boston, and has grown up to be one of the most impressive adults that I know that came out of St. Mark's, Natick, in Boston, and that I think tends to be the case. People that give their Sunday school servants and uh, local people the hardest time are the people that go out and make a difference in the world. So Robby is in New York now, so I'm wearing my Giants jersey in celebration of his current location. Um, Robby, you work in finance, and that's like, people that work in computer science, like بيعمل كمبيوتر مش عارف. So finance is like, okay, he does something with numbers. I don't know. So what is it? Where's your, what, can you tell us what you do now?
yeah. I used to work in investment banking, um, and now I am a corporate strategist at a large financial institution. So I do stuff with like numbers and
Yeah, it's numbers,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
but
it's like.
yeah, the computers, numbers. That's about.
So what do you do? Like, what does that mean that you do strategy?
Um, Banks are complex firms, and there's a lot of external and internal factors that we are constantly taking into consideration when thinking about the future of um, financial services. So my day to day consists of talking to, our different lines of businesses at the bank, understanding where their needs are, understanding if we're doing a good enough job of meeting those needs, and if we're not, uh, it's basically assessing how we can be better at what we do. So how we can provide the best impact to the communities that we serve, how we can provide the greatest value to all of our stakeholders, um, and how we can consistently grow in a time which, as we've currently seen, is certainly very volatile.
So how long have you been at this job? Was it before March, or um, did you kind of
Mm-hmm.
start? Was it before March?
Yeah, I've been doing this for almost 2 years now.
Oh wow! At the strategy place with like the different numbers job.
Right.
So how did that change with COVID?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it was a reset, not just in banking, but I think in all industries. It was a way that a lot of people kind of took a step back and reassessed their business model to really understand whether we had um, the processes in place to really deal with something as significant as a pandemic that kind of puts the world on hold. Uh, Luckily for U.S. financial institutions, we're all super well capitalized. We've all come out of the 2008 financial crisis a little bit jaded. Um, so banks are prepared for the worst. So in a way, things didn't change so much right now for us, but it was a matter of saying, okay, all of these plans that we have had laid out for the next 3 to 5 years, we need to reassess, and we need to go back to the drawing board and really understand how what happened in the last 6 months really affects the way that we can continue to provide value at the level that we've been able to in times that might not be as easy, because clearly we've been riding a high for the last 5 to 10 years. So it's going to be a bit difficult to kind of go from there, and be able to, start from scratch and be able to kind of go back to the drawing board.
It's interesting that you're asking about the processes because I don't know if you're familiar with Clayton Christensen. He's the guy that wrote about disruptive innovation. He's like a Harvard Business School guy, and he's the one that kind of said like you got to be watchful for these disruptions, right? They can come from the outside, they can come from competition, they can come from like new ideas that change industries. And what he says is uh, you have to have either the processes and or the values in place. So if your values are, we respond to certain things and we change and we are able to adapt to the situation, then even if you don't have the processes in place, then the values will kind of drive the change in the processes. But if you have neither the values nor the processes, that's a problem. Like I was thinking about that as you were talking, that you're focusing on the processes. Can you share with us a little bit about what you think your organizational values are, and in terms of how that kind of drove the changes, if any changes really needed to be made?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for my own organization when I say we're very people oriented. There's a very strong emphasis on the community and how we impact the community. Um, and as a large financial institution, your primary goal is to be able to meet the needs of everybody, across the spectrum, whether that's, a couple that, wants a mortgage to buy a home, whether that's another large company that's acquiring another company, right? The spectrum is so wide that it's very difficult to say that our values lie anywhere else other than just serving our communities. So I think that value system is in place. And I think our culture speaks to that, because if you don't have these values in place, then it's really difficult for an organization to have the people involved really, be on board with this, especially at a time like this, right? During a pandemic, or during any time where the circumstances get a bit difficult, if an organization doesn't have the values in place, as you said, it's really difficult to have employees and everybody up and down the spectrum kind of all buy in, right? So I think buy-in by the people at an institution is super, super important, because those are the people that ultimately drive the processes that we're talking about that need to be, reassessed. So I think the values being placed on communities and on making impact and being able to be flexible and nimble, are really key tenets that I think every organization, not just banks, are making sure that they, feel confident that they have. And it extends. I think it extends honestly beyond just organizations. I think just as people as well. I think everybody is realizing now that we need to be more flexible than before, and in the same ways, we have to have the right values in place for ourselves to be able to, navigate our own personal lives during, a time where you felt like everything was kind of put on hold.
Where do you think those values come from? Because the organization is obviously a complex entity, right? With leadership and like middle management, and then the people that do the day-to-day work. And I don't know where you are. Like strategy is probably like pretty high up in terms of like the corporate structure, and I think all of those different elements kind of come together to form a corporate culture, right? But that corporate culture is not necessarily top down, not necessarily bottom up, and the values that are the underpinnings of that corporate culture are multifactorial. So, at least in your organization, how can you like? Where do you think those values come from in your organization?
I mean, I'll always say that the tone is set at the top, um, because you can see a difference. There are stark differences amongst organizations, where you can tell that the tone at the top certainly isn't, people oriented, or it's just profit driven or whatever. That's super key, because whatever that tone is that's been set will drive the type of people that you bring into an organization. So to a certain extent, um, corporate culture is driven by, you know, how these organizations are marketed, not to the community, but to potential employees, because you're going to attract the culture that you're trying to create. So to a certain extent, yes, the tone is set at the top, but unless everybody's bought in, and unless everybody's kind of on the same page where they say, this is what we want, then it's going to be really challenging to try to change the way an organization operates. So it's up to everybody, I think, to have certain values in place, or to buy into a certain set of values, because without your own investment into it, I don't know that you'll be able to produce what an organization is looking for.
Do you think these ideas are restricted to just a corporate entity, like a bank or a hedge fund, or?
No, I think that extends everywhere. I think every single type of organization, every type of community, every type of person, I think, goes through that internal struggle of trying to understand, okay, what values are set in place for me? How can I meet my expectations when things get hard? How can I stick to my values? How can I stick to my morals when things are challenging for me? So it's obviously it's not just a corporate, challenge, but I think it's a challenge for any community or any group of people that are looking for tone and are looking for people to truly buy into that.
So a lot of the conversations I've been having with people, with the other uh, people invited to the "I Mustache You Something" series, um, are related to the Coptic Church and our church community, and the identification of these values, and if this sort of group identity is not something that's just restricted to a bank or a place of work, but also extends to a place of worship, or a cultural community or a faith community, then how do you go about identifying these values sort of amongst our sort of extended Coptic community? And you can answer that, in relation to Natick, where you grew up. You can answer that in relation to St. Mark's in Manhattan, where you pray now, or just the New York and New England diocese, or the Coptic Church as a whole. Like wherever you feel like you've got a good sense of the values and how those values kind of came about.
I can speak to my experience in growing up, at least in Natick, as an example. And obviously everyone has their experiences everywhere. And you carry those with you, right? So to a certain extent, I would say, and feel free to chime in because you've obviously experienced the community as well. It's a really strong church community. Would you agree with that statement? Like it's a really strong faith-based community, because of the leadership that's been there. Everybody from Abuna Musa all the way down the spectrum. They've set a tone. They've defined this, this community of people that all came from Egypt around the same time, that all started these types of different small businesses, family-owned businesses, right? There, in my experience growing up, there was like a real sense of rallying together. Like, hey, everything's super difficult for all of us. We all came here. We're all kind of in the same position. So let's all work together. Let's all use this house of worship as a place not only to, find ourselves in Christ, but also to find ourselves in um, a place that's foreign to us, in a place where we might not always feel welcome, in a place where we feel our kids are going to grow and share the same values that we did, right? So I think in Natick in particular, uh, there was such a strong and defining leadership growing up that it was really easy for myself, for other friends to grow up and really have kind of a shining image to look up to and say, this is what it means to be a Copt, and this is what it means to be in the community and serving. And those are really powerful images for us because I guess when I think about myself, I had a really challenging time trying to understand, you know, who my role models were and who I was supposed to look to as kind of the defining roles that I wanted my future to kind of look like. So you begin in your head to kind of internalize what it means to be a Coptic, um, to just be a Copt, and also to be this person that grows up in the world outside of the church, and it's a balancing act almost, right? Where you have certain values in place in one area, and you also have values in place in another area. But what I think stood out to Natick in particular, and the way that I grew up, was the fact that the leadership was so strong in my church growing up, and the people were so powerful, and were so well spoken, that it was so easy to cling to their words and say, this is, what I'm looking for. This is what I want to be, and this is what I'm striving to be. So when you weigh that out versus, the world that you may be in on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in your career, whether it's at school, whatever it is, you felt that the pendulum was swinging in one direction. And I think that was because of the leadership that we had in place in Natick growing up.
And in terms of the tension from the other end, where did that tension come from?
Well, I think it's the same. I think it's the same tension that everybody feels. And this is a conversation that we had recently where we were talking about conflict, and the conflict that, we as Coptic men sometimes feel, with various value systems coming from different places. So a certain set of values coming from your church community, and another set of values coming from, the community that, and again, this was my personal experience, because I know of many people that have grown up in communities that are very faith-based, and every day, whether they're at school, whether they're at work, whether they're at church, they're surrounded by a lot of the same people. My experience was different, where I spent Saturdays and Sundays with people that I shared a faith with, but Mondays through Fridays, I was sharing it with people that didn't necessarily share the same values, right? So the people that I went to school with, the people that I went to work with. So there's that constant tension, that I think causes the internal conflict that a lot of people feel. So when we're talking about, like, having people buy into a corporate culture, right? It's really easy to do that because you're spending every day there. You're spending your days with these people, and you're dedicating your life in a lot of people's experiences to their jobs, right? It's my life right now revolves around my job and providing value, and the best way to provide value is to buy in, right? So in a lot of faith-based communities, and I think for a lot of people like maybe you or I, that becomes a bit more of a challenge because you're not dedicating every waking moment to this, community. Um, you're dedicating yourself to your faith, but in terms of like the actual service to the community, it's really challenging to say I'm going to spend 7 days a week, 24/7 right here. So it's much more difficult to be able to say, hey, I'm going to buy into this fully
Hmm.
when I have so many other things at the same time coming in on the other end.
So I think that somebody that's listening to this might have two thoughts, and I'd like you to comment on both of them, and you can pick which one you want to study first or to discuss first. Um, the first one is, well, that's why we need to surround our young people with uh, contact with our community 24/7, right? And I guess the question would be, how realistic is that? Perhaps, if you're in a place like New Jersey or Melbourne or, Toronto, where they have like huge, huge, huge Coptic communities, you can do a Coptic school. You can have people, surrounded by Coptic people 24/7 until the age of 18. But then for other places that you don't have that kind of volume, you don't have that kind of numbers, how do you respond to that? And then, even in those places where people, okay, like now they're 18, like, are you going to have a Coptic college? You're going to have only Coptic businesses? Are they only going to work and interact with Coptic people? At what point, do we have to recognize that you can't insulate people, right? Like this NBA bubble that they created. Like, is that what we want? Do we want a Coptic bubble? That's one thing that I'm hearing you say that might be taken as like, okay, well, if the problem is that you're not spending enough time in church, then like fine, then let's fix that problem. And then the other thing is the universal nature of our values, right? Where if we value love and respect and caring, and you mentioned like your corporate culture is a giving culture, like caring about the community, then it's very possible for you to be Saturday, Sunday at church caring about those things, and then Monday through Friday caring about the same things in a different context, right? So how really difficult is it if there's a disconnect, and how do we manage that disconnect? So maybe you can answer the Coptic bubble question first, and then include, or we can move on with another question on how to integrate our values so that they're unified and we're congruent over the course of our week.
Yeah, I don't think you can answer question 2 before answering question 1, because and I think the answer is really simple. I think the answer is that in times of conflict, one tends to find themselves quite easily. So for a lot of people, for example, when pandemic happens and real life feels like it stopped, a lot of the values, a lot of the things that they had in place that they felt like were really strong also kind of stopped as well, right? So gyms closed, churches closed, da, 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 da. Slowly start to realize, hey, I'm not actually working out anymore that much. Hey, I'm not actually praying by myself that much. Hey, I'm not doing whatever it may be, right? And I think it's because it's really easy when you have institutions in place and all this stuff to feel like you can go through the motions. It's super easy to say, hey, every weekend I'm going to go to church, I'm going to be a deacon, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to feel some sort of fulfillment and satisfaction in my life because I can kind of check that box off. And so and we don't feel, and that's more subconscious. You don't really feel that. You just feel like, hey, I'm doing the right thing and this is good. So I think for a lot of people, when they deal with conflict, when you're not in a bubble at all times, when you're constantly being, you're facing this tension, those are the moments where you really understand, okay, where are my values? Because whatever you have deep inside of you, whatever internal person is within you, um, that person is going to come out in the end when you're faced with conflict. It's very easy to be in a Coptic bubble and be the best Copt there is. Like, it's really easy to like know the hymns and to be a deacon and to serve, or to you know do all of the things that make like a tunt or uncle like pat you on the back and say that Habibi. Like, it's really easy to do those things, but I don't know that that necessarily equates to being to saying, hey, I found myself, and I found comfort in this community, therefore I am complete as a person. Because if you don't challenge yourself to realize what your identity is outside of an institution, when something like a pandemic hits, then you're sitting there looking in the mirror, scratching your head saying, well, who the heck am I really? So I think tension is good. I think conflict is good. As much as it's a difficult process, as much as it's really challenging to have to look yourself in the mirror and say, hey, am I doing this for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons? As challenging of an experience as that is, as long of an experience as that is, whether that's just like a 6-month existential crisis, or whether that's the next 15, 20 years of your life trying to reevaluate who you are, I think those are the most rewarding experiences, because it's in times of pain and it's in times of difficulty that you can create a foundation for something that is real. And it's not just based on, well, this is how I grew up and this is what my parents want for me, so that's why I'm going to do this, or, because this is what my faith says. And I shouldn't question what my faith is, because my faith knows more than there's a lot of ways in which we make excuses for trying to find answers. And there's a lot of ways we come up with these excuses to not ask the right questions.
Mm.
So to answer your first question, I think Coptic bubbles are silly. And to answer your second question, the only way to really be able to instill people with these values, to have them really buy in, is if they find themselves within it. They don't find a caricature of themselves, or they don't find, a model of what it means to be, a Copt, and what it means to be, I think you throw all of those preconceived notions out the window and you say, well, what does it mean to be Mina Masiha, and what does it mean to be Coptic, right?
Mm. So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is you want members of our community, and we haven't specified at what age yet, but members of our community to be allowed to see something outside of our community, and potentially for them to like what they see outside of our community, and for them to come back to our community and say, hey, I like this thing outside of the community better than what I like in the community. And for that to potentially be threatening to their identity, and potentially threatening to our group identity, right? Because if they go out and they say, oh, I liked X, and someone comes back and says, no, we don't do X here, then maybe they can convince some people and poison the well. I think that's the concern, right? Is the Coptic bubble is pure water, and anything that's outside of this Coptic bubble is going to taint it in some way. So what if someone says, no, we've got everything that we need here, and anything outside of this pure well of pure water is going to be in some way adulterating what it means to be Coptic?
You know, I would tell that person that that ignorance is bliss,
Hmm.
because I don't know that, like, I don't know that I necessarily want to challenge people that feel a strong connection to their communities. I don't I don't want to sound like I'm attacking really strong communities of people, that, because again, as I said, I grew up in a community that rallied together, that felt like, it was them versus the world. And um, so I understand the value. I understand where people come from with the idea that, we all share the same value system. We all share the same faith. We should all be, you know, we have all of the nourishment and the knowledge, and we have so much to learn and grow from each other. But I think what gets complicated is for people like me not to have the experiences, but constantly see them. So, because the argument that,
What do you mean
you're
by that? These experiences, but not necessarily see them.
so the way that you kind of presented it to me, right? When I hear that type of question,
Hmm.
the person that I picture in my mind is um, maybe somebody who is an immigrant from Egypt, who uh, didn't wasn't necessarily challenged with the same challenges that maybe you or I faced. And or I'm picturing somebody um, who grew up in a very strong community and didn't really have to, again, see anything that they didn't want to see.
Can you clarify
I,
what you mean by those challenges? Because I think I understand what you mean, but I think someone listening or watching might not necessarily uh, follow exactly what you mean by challenges.
Different schools of thought, different ways of living, right? Um, different ways of having fun, or uh, dealing with difficult times, or it runs the gamut, right? I'm using it as loosely as possible because I feel like there's no real definition to what challenges are. I'm not gonna, you know, I just I think it's silly to limit um, the challenges, and I think it doesn't do anybody justice to try to define what a challenge is, because to me, my challenges might seem, ridiculous, maybe to you or to somebody else, right? So I think people see what they want to see. Um, and for people that may have not grown up in the US and have had to deal with the types of things that we dealt with in terms of, you know, going to school here, living away from your family starting at age 18 or whatever, having all of these different things occur to you. If you don't have those experiences, it's really challenging for you to be able to say to somebody else, like, I see where you're coming from and I understand
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
So I would say ignorance is bliss. I understand you think that this is helpful, but it's really difficult for me to try to rehash my experiences to you, to try to make you understand that, you know, seeing the world and trying to explore who you are in that world is okay. And I
Hmm.
think that's what gets lost in translation. I think a lot of people grow up with the idea that the church is holding them back, and that they're kind of caged in, and that they're not allowed to express who their identities are and be this person, and really feel truly valued as they are, because it's such a strong ethnic group. It's such a strong community with like very stringent traditions and rituals that date back, whatever, 1,000 years. Like, it's really difficult to try to question the tradition that's set in place for you.
Mm.
And that's what gets lost in translation. It's not the fact that, I want people to go and indoctrinate themselves and to do whatever and treat their wives like you know just frivolously. I think people just need to start to understand more how to explore themselves within the context um, that makes them feel like they're being themselves, and know that that's not mutually exclusive from still being a part of this community and still being a Copt and still being religious and having a spiritual life that is more than just, going to church on a Saturday or Sunday and going through the motions.
And you're touching on something that I think is a complicated question of identity, where it's a Western idea to have this self identity, who I am, and like finding myself, and it's more of an Eastern, particularly in Asian communities. There's no such thing really as like who I am. Like it's who we, and I think as Copts, we're a little bit of this and a little bit of that, right? Like there's a group identity that's important, but as Copts, particularly Copts in the diaspora, and as Copts in sort of westernized parts of Egypt, I think there's this nagging question of, okay, I get who we are, but who am I? And I think the Coptic bubble advocates, right, don't see value in the individual. Or if they do, they say, well, listen, you're going to be the best individual possible here with us, right? If you go there, hey, they're going to ruin you. If you go out, you're going to let someone else tell you who you are, right? And I think there's a tension there between the self-identity, the group identity, and it's not just a Western propaganda or brainwashing to have an individual identity. It's a Christian concept also, right? Like
Right.
we see in the Bible, Jesus didn't say, okay, here's the program, everybody's going to do this. He met each individual person as an individual and said, hey, I love you. I want you to be self-actualized, right? Even if that person was doing something wrong, he would say, hey, what's happening here? And he would treat them as a person, as a valuable person. So I think you're touching on some like really important concepts and really important ideas. But again, I think that there are certain people hearing this that are going to be threatened by this and threatened by this idea that our community is incomplete, right? They will say, we have everything that we need in Christ. So can you clarify a little bit about what the difference is between having everything we need in Christ versus, this Coptic bubble insulating us from anything outside?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the idea that, finding yourself and finding Christ, these are not two mutually exclusive concepts, right? Like I think back to, and I'm not a religious scholar, but I remember reading one of maybe Saint Anthony's first letter, right? He wrote like a series of letters. Like he went out right into the desert, and in my head, when I like think about his journey, I think about a dude that was just like trying to find himself really hard. Like so that, and obviously like the moment I start to get heretical, just stop me and tell me like, no, this isn't the story. But like he hears a verse right in the church or whatever, and he was like, I want to go out into distance. I want to like sell all I have and whatever. So he goes off into the distance. I picture a guy that is like really trying to understand who he is and has a community and has all of the things in place that we Copts today, you know pride ourselves on as saying this is the end all be all. And he says, for lack of a better word, screw all this for a second and let me just go out let me just go out by myself into the desert. And that's crazy, right? Like that's such a bizarre thing to want to do. But this man goes out into the desert to go find himself. And to me, that's the same as every other person here that's like, I don't know who I am and I want to explore all this stuff. It's like, well, if I haven't been able to find it within these four walls, then I need to step out of these four walls and find Christ and find myself, because those things run in tandem. I need to find that everywhere else. So he goes out into like the desert, whatever, and he's like having these experiences. And he writes this letter, and I don't remember everything about it, but I remember him speaking about having an internal man or an inner man, right? And basically he talks about trying to find this inner man, and life being this like journey of finding this inner man. And he talks about finding it through control of your body, your mind, and spirit, right? And again, as cops, we found ways to convolute things and to make them into things that they might not actually be. But he talks about just understanding your body and understanding how to control your body and understanding how to hear your body. And in the same ways, how to control your mind. And all of these things, to me, the way I perceive it is a man trying to find himself through experiencing the world as it is. It's not trying to, conjure up a bubble and say, I'm going to explore within these parameters and these parameters only, and have to find my satisfaction here. It's, let me experience the world as it is. Christ says he's going to accept me as I am. So let me embrace this idea. Let me embrace the concept of truly trying to find Christ in all of the little things in life, and trying to see him and trying to gain that spiritual confidence outside of just the things that I know and grew up with and feel, comfort in. You truly do find yourself in times of conflict. And I think it's in those times of conflict that we find Christ, right? Like when what happens when the disciples are in the boat, right? And like the waves get crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're in the middle of a storm. Like, yeah, we're in the middle of a storm. The world's crazy. Like everything is like, and Christ comes and he stills it. But like, I don't know where I don't know where the fear is sometimes. And again, I have this fear. So it's something internalized, I think, within all of us. But there's a lot of fear with trying to explore what is unknown to us. So that's why I don't challenge anybody that says, hey, you know what, I'm comfortable here and this is where I want to be. Okay, find your comfort, find your peace, find your happiness. But for those of you that haven't found that, it's okay to explore. St. Anthony explored. All these people explored. They literally went out into the middle of nothingness. And if that's our definition of society today, then go out into nothingness and find Christ there.
Is there a type of exploration that should be discouraged or too dangerous?
I don't know, man. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm in the process of exploring. I think I don't know what's on limits. I don't know what's off limits. All I know is that Christ is everywhere. I know that within my faith, it tells me that Christ is going to accept me as I am, regardless of the experiences that I've had. Because I think that's also a piece of it, where for many of us who have explored the world, who have seen different ways of thinking and have maybe felt as though they've distanced themselves from the faith. They feel as though, I can never be accepted back into this community because they're one way and I'm the other. There's no, like, this is a group of people that are, they don't understand. They don't, like, a lot of us feel as though we can't find full acceptance in our faith again. And that again is like another, not a real Christian concept. Like, you hear the story of the prodigal son, right? That's a story where, like, we when we tell that story, right? Or like when we tell that lesson, when we teach that lesson to kids, what's usually the message behind that one? It's like a story about repentance, right?
Hmm.
It's like the son was repentant and he realized what he was missing, and so he went back to his father's house, and like his father, embraced him and all this stuff. And I remember somebody exploring that story from a different perspective that made way more sense to me. Whereas, like, this wasn't a story about repentance. Like, in nowhere in the story did it say that the son was repentant.
Right.
This is just a story about God's love, like
Right.
his pure agapic love, this selfless love that doesn't care what you did and how you did it and all these things. What he cares about is that you're here and you're with him, right? The reason the son went back to his father's home is because he was out of money and he was out of food and he was hungry. He's like, well, where's the only place I can go get it? Can I go back home? That's all we hear. Maybe he was repentant. But that's the story.
Right. Right.
So that's not to say that we all have to sprint out of our father's homes and think that we're going to all get it back to us. But it's an understanding that no matter where we've gone, and if we've tried to find ourselves and found ourselves in really dark places and places where we feel like we've challenged, the value places, like, that doesn't mean it's game over for you. Like, Christ will always be there and your faith will always be there. And that agapic love, that embrace will always be there. It's just a matter of understanding that, internalizing that, and being able within the confines of that love to try to find who you actually are.
I think you said something that a lot of people really underestimate, which is a lot of people self-distance from our community because they feel like they'd never be accepted back. And that's a complex emotion, and that's a complex decision to make that might be rooted in, oh, I don't want to go back because they're judgmental, right? But could equally be, I don't want to go back because part of me feels like I'm not good enough, right? I haven't lived up to a certain standard, right? Do you think it matters why someone feels sort of disengaged or unwelcome in our community? Does it matter which one of those things it is? If they have like a negative feeling about the community or a negative feeling about themselves, does it make a difference?
I think for a lot of people that it can be a jading experience where, you've gone through that and you feel, to a certain extent, I will never find the acceptance I need. Therefore, this is forever. The door has been closed. So in that way, yes, absolutely. I think it matters. I think that feeling matters. And I think on the flip side of that, for the people in the community, and again, going back to the person that says, that the bubble is the only way, you point to the flock that's missing. You point to the people that have had these negative experiences, and you point to them and you say, well, if this bubble is, as you say, all well and good, then explain to me how so many are missing from it, and refuse to even acknowledge its presence going forward. I've had this conversation with many, many people where they've had their experiences. They know these people, they know their Coptic church to be X, Y, and Z, and this person said this to me, and this ton said this, and this Abuna said this during the sermon, and I will never go back because they did that, right? It might not be, that might not be representative of what our faith actually is. And 9 times out of 10, it isn't. But that's a really challenging experience, and for many people, traumatic to have to go through, because if we're told this is the place, our sanctuary, and this is our home, and this is where we're supposed to find ourselves and all of this stuff, and I've had such a dark experience in this place because of the way people in the community have treated me, because the way I've seen them treat others, because of what I was involved when I was in the community, then I think that in and of itself should be a self-reflective moment for the church and for the people in it. A lot of the times I'll speak to people older than me who grew up in the same communities and have had a lot of the same experiences. However, I mean, in terms of experiences, they've gone through kind of the same types of things that I have. They've gone through the same types of, spiritual retreats and the same types of services they were involved in, right? But in terms of like the actual experience itself and the breadth of it and the meat of it all was super different, right? It's almost like 2 different worlds. And I've had one person before even describe it to me as me, Robby, experiencing church 2.0, and that they experienced the 1.0 version, right? Like there was kind of like a system refresh where I experienced things a little bit lightly because, the church finally realized, oh, like the only way we're going to keep people in the church is like if we kind of, water it down a bit more and make it a little bit more digestible, where what they dealt with was something much different and was like these strict rules, and it's my way or the highway, and da 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 da. And I think it's funny to me because what they're describing as like church 2.0 is really just the ancient church in and of itself at its core, right? But we've found ways to add additional barriers to getting to that faith and trying to get to what all the tradition and the ritual really wants to get at. So when you have those experiences, when you have those negative experiences with the church, of course you're going to be turned off, and of course you're going to say, I don't ever want to go back. And I don't blame those people, and I don't ever try to push them and say, no, you know what, like it's really difficult to try to say, hey, I've dealt with a traumatic experience here, and for some reason I feel like it's going to be different. So I think it's a self-reflective moment for the church, and I think it's part of the growing pains of being in a new country and having many of the congregants come from a different society and a different culture where the values are different and the norms are different. These are growing pains, and I think really challenging things that I think benefit the church ultimately, because people like you and I can have these conversations, and hopefully we can try to mitigate the risk of that happening for more people in the future.
So I'm hearing you reflect on 2 things that I think are parallel processes, where as an individual, I can make a mistake. And as a community, as a group, we can make a mistake, right? As an individual, I might, in the process of trying out a certain value or certain behavior or certain type of thing, I can deviate from something that I initially thought was healthy and beneficial and virtuous, but it turns out actually to be harming me and bringing me away from God, right? And what you're saying now is that the community can do the same thing. Like we can have certain practices and certain behaviors and certain ways that we treat each other, but then discover, you know what, like we're driving people away with these practices. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do with this series is it, try to improve dialogue, right? So I suppose again it seems to be coming late because I kind of get caught up in the conversation with people, but I must ask you something. How do we get there where we're able to say that we don't encourage people to make mistakes, right? We're not telling people like, oh, go make a mistake so that you have a good reason to repent. Like St. Paul, clearly speaks against that, right? But how do we give people the space to be themselves, where they don't have to be a different person Saturday and Sunday from the person that they are Monday through Friday? They can be congruent, they can be consistent in who they are. And when they make a mistake, we're able to say, hey, we don't agree with what you did, but we love you. And we want to be a place of healing that you can move past. And then we'll get to the other side of that question, which is when we make a mistake as a community, how do we as a group repent from that and say, no, listen, like this person actually, would have stuck around if we had treated them better. And it's not like they didn't distance themselves from the community because of sin or because of, like their saya or whatever. Like, no, like they distanced themselves from the community because they had genuine concerns about the community that needed to be addressed. So first, let's address the individual, like how do you speak to that individual, and how do you speak to the community, and how do you envision us creating an environment where that's actually possible?
Yeah, it's really challenging. I think as I said, as I mentioned way in the beginning, like tone at the top is so important and so influential, regardless of whether whether or not that leadership is strong or not. Whatever tone has been set is how everybody else follows. I can talk to how supportive of a community it's challenging, right? Because a lot of people's bad experiences and a lot of the reasons so many people have been turned away from the church has been based on their experiences with other congregants and with members of the community. So to answer the question, how do we change the community, is something that I don't know how to answer. And I'm always, racking my brain for an answer on that, because I don't know that you can change the way a person has been conditioned to think, based on, their societal value. Like I have these conversations with my parents all the time when I'm back home. They grew up in Egypt. They worked in Egypt. They got married in Egypt, right? Like their life as they know it is defined by the societal values, by the culture, by the norms that were put in place in Egypt, right? And by contrast, I have gone to school, I've worked, I've done everything here in the United States from a very different lens than they have. We share the same values, but in terms of getting to that place, there's a very thick wall in between them. And we chip at it through having conversations, through engaging in dialogue where, you know, I can be honest about my experiences and say, hey, this is how this is how I perceive what it means to be a good Christian, and what it means um, to um, serve my community, and what it means to bring others to the, like, we can have those conversations where I don't feel as though I'm closing myself off. They don't feel as though they're not being heard. Um, and while we might not ever get to a point where we're both on the exact same page or on the exact same wavelength, I think we're constantly getting closer to a place where, like, okay, I think we both understand we're working at the same thing. And I think the church needs to have a conversation with itself, with its congregation, about how we're all working towards a lot of the same things. But what gets in the way is that brick wall of 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 societal um, differences, of cultural differences, right? So if the church can reimagine itself as a faith that's not based on an ethnic group, not based on, you know, a language that might be like, the more you can strip out the things from the church that are actually not faith-based, the things that are cultural, the more you can get to the root of what it actually means to be a Coptic Orthodox Christian. Because I would argue, to be a Coptic Orthodox Christian, you could probably sum it up into, you know, a paragraph this big. But the way that we've defined it now, to be a Coptic Orthodox Christian, you need to be all of this. And inside this list, it means being Egyptian, being doctor, being married to another Egyptian, being, you have to know how to sing Omonogenes by yourself. And if you don't know how to sing it by yourself, then you need to go back and teach. And then you got, right? Like we created all of these different layers. So I think it's a matter of like, all right, going through that list and saying, does this go here? No. Okay, so let's remove that. And let's remove this. And let's try to remove all of the cultural barriers that take us away from what the faith actually is. And a good example of that is the community, at least that I am in right now in New York, or the community that I've seen in Boston, where it's a newer community that wasn't necessarily founded because all of us were, you know, we didn't all immigrate from Egypt or anything of that sort, but we're all here in New York City. We're all working. We're all part of the same faith-based community. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we're all Egyptian. We didn't all come from Shobra. We didn't all, you know, study medicine, or, you know what I mean, right? So there's a beauty in how discongruent the congregation actually is, right? So to a certain extent, the more a congregation is diverse, the more, you know, you don't feel the constant pressure to live up to a certain ethnic standard, for lack of a better term. I think the church gets closer to what it's supposed to be doing. But I don't know how, I don't know what the mechanism is by which that happens.
Yeah, I don't think any of us do, but you did mention that dialogue is going to be an essential part of that, right? Like not just saying, well, I believe what I believe, and I'm not really interested, but like if you are invested in your relationship with your parents, then you guys have that dialogue, right? if you are invested in that relationship with your congregation, give them the benefit of the doubt to say, hey, I don't feel welcome here, and this is why, right? And I think if we are brave enough to bring that up and say, hey, I feel excluded, and this is why, then if the congregation responds with, well, that's a good reason to feel excluded, we actually don't want your kind here, then, you know, that kind of answers the question. It's like, okay, well, I didn't leave, you kicked me out, right? But if the congregation responds with, لا ليه حبيبي لا ما ينفعش كده, what did we do, right? If there's a response that is loving and caring as Christ loved and cared, then it doesn't become a matter of social programming, as you said. We're like, okay, here's the requirements. Like, listen, I don't want to live up to any of these requirements except that I want to love God and I want to take communion and I want to confess and I want to be part of this faith community on a spiritual level, but not on a, you know, social programming level. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can I just come and pray liturgy? Is that okay? Can I just come and like do activities with the kids? Or do I need to follow all these other rules? And I think it's, you know, there's a balance there, right? Like, you know, it's like, oh, well, you know, I want to participate in this community, but I also want to do all of these other horrible things. And it's like, well, okay, maybe we can work through those things, right? And how we define horrible things might be different, but I don't think you're saying that we shouldn't have any standards at all, but we should grow through a life in Christ, and we should grow through relationships with each other and how these things evolve, but not as a demand. Like, before you step into this door, you better have X, Y, and Z, right? Because if we do that, then people will go, okay, well, no, I can't live up to that. I'm sorry. And we say the hospitals, the church is a hospital, right? Not a court of law. But, you know, when we make demands and when we say these are the expectations, you better live up to them, I think a lot of us feel, okay, well, I'm sorry, I can't live up to these demands. I'm sorry, I don't meet your standards. Please forgive me. We don't forgive. Okay, there's the door. So I think maybe the only thing that we can encourage, and disagree with me if you think this is unfair, but from listening to you, I think that if you can't change the community, at least let them know, right? At least say to someone in a position of influence in your community, I don't feel welcome and this is why. And I would love to be here, but the reason I don't come back and I don't participate is because I feel excluded for this reason. And then it's up to the community to respond. If they say, let's respond, then great. If they say, no, we don't want you here anyway, then okay, that answers the question. But I do think by and large, a lot of people, particularly now, I think we're in an unprecedented time now in our church environment, that the leaders really have wide open ears and they really want to know how to make this a better place for all of our congregants. Like, you know, the youth that are there, how can we make it more enjoyable for you to be here? The youth that aren't here, to answer that question of why and how, and, you know, is there anything that can be done about it? Because I think that they're realizing there's a lot of people that love God and love the faith elements of our community, but they just don't really feel like they fit in on a social, cultural level, which is something that can be remedied. It's not like a fixed thing, like, hey, you get the best. So thank you. I appreciate, as always, your reflections, Robby. Do you have any closing words here for the audience?
I guess one last point on what you said on the church being a hospital. If I could leave it off with the fact that everybody in the congregation is broken. Everybody within those doors, or within those four walls, are broken people. I hope people acknowledge that, and I hope they acknowledge their own brokenness and can see the church in that lens. And if you can do that, you get closer to finding yourself.
Amen. Thank you, Robby. And thank
Later,
you
man.
guys for listening.